Today we're talking about angles. Now, I'm sure if you look around, you can find loads of examples of angles in the real world. We see them in architecture, in the products we use, even our own bodies. So let's get into it. So first off, what is an angle? Well, it's made up of rays, and a ray is a part of a line that extends just in one direction. So if I take this ray and slide it over so their endpoints overlap, boom, we have an angle. Now, we have special words for each of the parts of an angle. So those rays, those are called the sides of the angle. And the point where they come together is called the vertex. It's like the corner of the angle. And the space in between the sides is called the interior of the angle. Now, when you're naming an angle, you want to look for the vertex and two other points on the angle, one on each side. So in this angle, the vertex is the point B, and then we have point A on one side and point C on the other. Great. So we'll name this angle, angle ABC. Now the order of the letters doesn't matter as long as the vertex is in the middle. So in this angle, the vertex is B, so we have to have the letter B in the middle. So also notice that we're using the angle symbol here. It's like this little corner symbol, kind of looks like its own little mini angle. All right, so like we said, order doesn't matter. So we could also call this angle, angle CBA. Again, the order doesn't matter as long as that vertex B is in the middle. Now there's actually one other way to name this angle, which is just angle B. But you have to be careful with this one because some angles can be named with one letter, but some can't. So we'll get into that in just a minute. Sometimes you also see a little number inside the angle. So in that case, we would just call this angle 1. Pretty easy. All right, so when can you name an angle with just one letter? Well, you can do it if that's the only angle you see with that vertex. So in this case, we've got angle K here. That's the only angle with a vertex at K. So we can call it angle K and there's no confusion. On the other hand, over here, we've got angle M. Like if I were to say, hey, point to angle M, and that's all I told you, in this diagram, wouldn't you be a little confused? Like you might ask me, well, do you mean this angle here in purple? Or do you mean like this angle here in green? Or do you mean the whole thing? Like just calling it angle M is too confusing. There's not enough information to really identify which of those angles we're talking about. So this is a case where you have to use 3 letters to name those angles. So we would need to be given other points on those rays, like maybe L and N, and then we could call this angle LMN. And if I asked you to point to that one, you'd be able to find it because you would find L, M, and N, and you'd know that I was talking about this green angle here. So that's a difference. You can always name an angle with 3 letters, but you can only name it with 1 letter some of the time. So just be careful. So the measure of an angle is a number that tells us how much it opens up. So an angle with a bigger measure is going to open up more than an angle with a smaller measure. Now in the real world, we use a protractor to measure angles, but we'll save that for another video. One of the most common angles is this little, it makes like sort of a square corner. And the measure of that angle is 90 degrees. In fact, it's so common, we gave it its own name. It's called a right angle. And we can recognize right angles because they'll have a little square box in them. Now, if I take a right angle and I take that vertical side and just bend it in a little bit, now the measure won't be 90, but it'll be something a little bit less than 90. Versus if I took that same side and bent it out, now I have an angle that's wider than 90, so it would have a measure that's bigger than 90. So these different kinds of angles have their own special names. So an angle that's less than 90 is called acute. One that's more than 90 is called obtuse. And then there's that name again. A right angle is exactly 90 degrees. And then our last type is called a straight angle. And it almost doesn't even look like an angle. It looks like a straight line, but you can have an angle that opens up just to exactly 180 degrees. Now, as a side note, the word classify means to say what type it is. So when a question asks you to classify an angle, your answer is actually a word, like is it acute or obtuse or right? So just be aware of that. And then just like we can use X's in equations to stand for numbers that we don't know, we can also use variables like X to stand for angle measures that we may or may not know. All right, and last but not least, two angles that have the same measure are called congruent. So here we have two congruent angles because they both have a measure of 40 degrees. Now this word congruent has its own special symbol, which looks like this. It's an equal sign with a little squiggly above it. So if I wanted to write about these two angles being congruent, I might say angle CAT, and notice that angle has a vertex of A, so I'm putting A in the middle. I'm using my congruent symbol, and then angle DOG. So I would read this as angle CAT is congruent to angle DOG. On a diagram, we recognize congruent angles based on these little curves. So if two angles are congruent, then they'll both have a little curve going through them. And you can have one curve or two curves. In this trapezoid, we have some angles with two curves and others with just one curve. So however many curves an angle has, then any other angle with the same number of curves is going to be congruent to that one. And finally, sometimes we mark angles with the curve and a little dash going through it. So that's another way that we identify congruent angles. So that's it, you guys. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you next time.